Hello and welcome to Chakra News. On June 21st, 2025, US President Donald Trump confirmed that US had conducted airstrikes on key nuclear facilities in Iran, that is Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. These strikes involved 14 GBU-57 bunker-busting bombs dropped by the iconic B-2 Spirit stealth bombers and over 30 Tomahawk cruise missiles, which were launched from an Ohio-class guided missile submarine. Now, these weapons and platforms, particularly the strategic bombers, are uniquely fielded by the US alone, and they've become emblematic of US power. Other countries also have similar systems. Russia has the Tu-160, France, the Rafale with the ASMP-A. But what about India? Today, we're joined by the editor-in-chief at Chakra News, Sandeep Unnithan, who will break down for us where is India's strategic bomber. Hi, Sandeep. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Deepak. Good to be here.
Strategic bombers are in the news right now. Everybody's talking about what a strategic bomber is and why do countries need it. So let's just begin with this. What is a strategic bomber?
Well, a strategic bomber, Deepak, is an aircraft that can carry very heavy bomb loads and fly to very extended ranges, like upwards of 10,000 kilometers. Very few countries possess this capability now in 2025. There are just three countries, in fact, as you mentioned. The United States, it has three different types of strategic bombers. The Russian Federation, again, three different types of strategic bombers. And of course, China, which has just one type of strategic bomber. Now, these three of these countries are, of course, P5 nations. And India, by the way, is also in the queue to acquire a strategic bomber of its own. But that has unfortunately been delayed by the Russia-Ukraine war. That's what I can tell you.
Right. So India, as you've just noted, that India has been looking for a strategic bomber of its own. Now, this brings to my mind that the Indian Navy, in fact, had an aircraft which was used as a strategic bomber by the Russians. But what happened? I mean, strategic bombers have been around since the world wars. What happened? What happened to India's search for a strategic bomber over the past 70 years?
Well, Deepak, interesting question. Now, India has, bombers, aircraft, any military hardware is born out of your military requirements. Now, if your military requirements project the need for you to fly extended distances, say 10,000, 15,000 kilometers and deliver ordnance on target, then you will have a strategic bomber, right? Or if you, for instance, have a nuclear weapon which you want to deliver using an airborne platform over extended distances, then you will have a strategic bomber. So that's the reason that the P5 countries, three of them, still retain these bombers. The Russian Federation, of course, the United States, we just saw it, China also. France and the UK have retired their strategic bombers. Now, in India's case, very interestingly, we never had a projection, we never projected the requirement for a strategic aircraft of this kind that would carry bomb loads to such extended distances. And I'll start with this story. It's very interesting that way back in the 70s, in the late 60s, early 70s, in fact, around 1971, the Soviet Union offered their Tu-22 bomber to us, supersonic bomber. It was, in fact, their first supersonic bomber to enter service. They offered it to the Indian Air Force at that time. And the Air Force, when they checked it out, but they were unimpressed by the aircraft. And they said, look, it has, various shortcomings, which was a fact. I mean, it was a extremely, glitch-prone aircraft. It had several issues while it was in service. The Tu-22. And a number of them were built, but user satisfaction was very low. So, the Air Force, the Indian Air Force at that time, they rejected it. They said, look, we don't need it. I think the chief at that time was Air Chief Marshal P.C. Lal. He and his team, they said, we don't need it. There are lots of issues there. And, so that whole mindset in India was not to have a strategic bomber. Whereas the Soviet Union wanted us to have the bomber. That's very interesting. Because, very often you see the Soviet Union projecting what they thought India should use or should field. Because, they just come out of fighting the most savage war in human history, right? The Second World War on the Eastern Front, it is the most savage war ever fought by man. And a lot of their thinking was shaped by that conflict and, of course, the Cold War that followed. Whereas in our case, this is not to criticize the Air Force, but I can see where they're coming from. The kind of the culture that the Indian Air Force inculcated was primarily a Royal Air Force kind of thing. Um, they didn't see the need for strategic bombing. We didn't have a requirement for aircraft like that. So, which is why you had the Indian Air Force saying, no, we don't need the Tu-22. It's too big. It doesn't meet our requirements. It has all kinds of issues, which they were correct in a way. But, then the whole thing is that when you acquire a platform, irrespective of the technical defects, you start to use it, you start to bring in the culture of having an aircraft that flies very long distances, which can carry your bomb loads. I think the Tu-22 had 10-ton bomb payload, which was much bigger than any of the other fighter jets at that time. But the Air Force rejected it. They said, no, we don't need it. And they instead went for the Jaguar. They said, look, the Jaguar meets our requirements. MiG-23 meets our requirements. But, you have to look at where you're coming from in the 70s. You're like completely Pakistan focused. Despite the fact that you had a clear threat from China as far back as 1962. But I think the Air Force was focused more on the secondary threat, if you can call it that, which was Pakistan. And it was very comfortable flying fighter jets that could also be bombers or specialist bombers like the Canberra and, smaller aircraft. They don't carry heavy bomb loads. But this whole thing of a bomber was a mindset issue. And, and it's very interesting, Deepak. Another quick thing, addition to that, is that in the late 70s, the Soviet Union again offered us a strategic, a nuclear submarine, a nuclear-powered attack submarine, right? This was a K-43, which was the Soviet Union's first submarine that could fire cruise missiles from under the water. I mean, that is like a phenomenal capability. You're locked in. And this was the first unit they had. They offered it to us on lease. Now, you had the then Navy chief who wrote on a file saying, we don't require this because we are still inducting submarines and we need to learn to walk before we can run. So very clearly at that time itself, our ability to absorb such complex platforms which have strategic implications was very limited, right? So the Tu-22 offer died its death in the 70s. It's not born until the 90s. Now it's very interesting again, post Kargil, when the Indian military kind of starts projecting its requirements. There is an intergovernmental agreement between India and the Russian Federation somewhere in the late 90s. I think it was 98 or 99, or around 2001, where we had three items on the agenda. So there was the Admiral Gorshkov, the Soviet era aircraft carrier, which we bought as the INS Vikramaditya. You had the Chakra, which is a Kula class nuclear powered attack submarine. That was also there on offer. And interestingly, 4 Tu-22 M3s. Now, this is an interesting aircraft, which is completely different from the Tu-22 of 1971 vintage. It's a completely new, redesigned aircraft. It's called the Tu-22 M3. So we are offered the M3 variant, which is called the Blackjack by NATO. Very capable supersonic aircraft. It had swing wings, could fly over Mach 2, I think. And this was on offer. 4 aircraft were offered to us. But then, a naval team traveled down to the Russian Federation. They inspected the aircraft. They saw the facilities. The Russians were offering this bomber to us as a maritime strike aircraft, right? A long-range maritime strike aircraft, which would be equipped with cruise missiles, of course. I think it was the KH-55 that they were offering. And this was on lease, a 10-year lease. And the catch there was that you can buy the aircraft on a 10-year, you can lease the aircraft for 10 years, after which we will review the terms of the lease. But then you would also have to buy all the ground support for that. So you have to buy the entire thing for, the support for the aircraft when you're flying it. So this was being offered to the Indian Navy. right? So there are 4 aircraft, extensive ground support, very expensive. I don't have the exact figures, but this is how it was. This is from someone who was part of that delegation, and they offered this. And then I think the Indian Navy took a decision like, look, for just 4 aircraft, the kind of the cost benefit analysis they looked at, it wasn't worth it.
Right.
Now, the other objection, interestingly, Deepak, came from the Indian Air Force. Now, the chief of the Indian Air Force went to the Indian Navy chief and he said, "Look, are you trying to, take over our turf? Why are you buying these bombers? Why are you leasing these bombers?" So they explained that, look, no, this is meant for maritime reconnaissance and strike and stuff like that. So it actually that deal just fell through. So the Vikramaditya came through. It's in service right now. The Chakra was leased. It finished its lease and was sent back to Russia a few years back. Chakra 3 is in the pipeline, but the Tu-22s kind of fell through. There was no revival of that deal for various reasons. But that question that you asked, Deepak, is about the Tu-142. So we had the Tu-142s, which the Russian Federation uses as a strategic bomber. It's called the Bear, right? Now,
Right.
this is an aircraft that we had a number of them. We had more than between 8 and 12 is what the Indian Navy operated during the Cold War, right from the 1980s to until very recently, a few years back. The Bears, but interestingly, were used as long-range maritime patrol aircraft and primarily anti-submarine warfare aircraft. And there were projections that were made for upgrading these aircraft and converting them into strike platforms and all. That didn't materialize. For some strange reason, the Navy chose to retire these aircraft, possibly for the same reason, maintenance and all of that. And they moved over to the American aircraft, which is the P-8Is, for the same role, long-range maritime patrol strike. But the strike element here in the P-8Is is very limited. I mean, it's not a bomber. It's a fighter jet flying very long distances with tactical missiles. It fires the Harpoon, which is a 100-kilometer range missile. And I just look at the lost opportunity here. Maybe if we had that mindset of I would say a Russian mindset or a Chinese mindset or even an American mindset of loading an aircraft, a bomber, converting an aircraft of such capabilities, which flies 12,000 kilometers. That's the range of the Tu-142 Bear. And if you were to fit in, say, a BrahMos or, air-launched missiles, long-range air-launched missiles, and you have a bomber right there. If we could have modified it, we could have used it as a strategic bomber as well. But somehow it didn't seem to strike anyone that you have a triad, right? You have the ground-based missiles, you have the air-launched vectors, which are basically fighter jets dropping bombs, and you have, of course, a sea leg, which is the submarine, the Arihant-class ballistic missile submarine. So somebody should have said, look, we have the Tu-142s, and we can rejig them as strategic bombers. We can carry our the gravity bombs that we have, the nukes that we have, the 20-kiloton weapons, and there you go. You have a long-range strategic bomber that can fly 12,000 kilometers, but that doesn't seem to have crossed anyone's mind. So we lost those 2 chances. And if you can say that while we had the Tu-142 in service, we never kind of exploited it to its full potential. We used it as a pure anti-submarine warfare platform, which is actually a disservice to that platform. It's a very rugged, robust platform, can fly extended distances. So then, it comes back to this mindset, Deepak, of not having the requirement, not thinking strategically, not thinking long range, not looking at who your primary adversary is, which is China. And it's only now that you have, I would say, post-Galwan, where India has begun to kind of reassess its requirements, its strategic requirements, and the realization that, China is your primary theater and Pakistan is your secondary theater. And very soon, both these theaters could merge into one, as we saw during Operation Sindoor.
So I was just going to come to this. Today, India, of course, sees China as its primary adversary. The 70s, of course, was a different time. And for a cash-strapped nation like India, it would arguably make sense, to choose the right horses for the right causes. Today, of course, the situation is vastly different. But again, 50 years have passed since then, more than half a century. And today, the kind of scenario, the battle space has also changed. So while the US is employing stealth bombers, the US also has aerial supremacy. How does India's search for a strategic bomber work in a space where we don't have aerial supremacy? At the best, it is a contested space. And furthermore, you also have the advent of drones, which are cheaper and which, as we've seen, are highly effective. How do you see the use case scenario for India? Do we need a strategic bomber today, or should we be focusing more on drones instead?
No, I think we need both, Deepak. I mean, there is one school of thought, the Elon Musk school of thought, which says that, you don't need man fighters. The era of man fighters are over. You just need drones, drones, drones. So then you look at this thing. We are about, 10 days after we're into the 10th or 11th, second week of the Israel-Iran war. You've just had the Americans dropping a hell of a lot of bomb load on Iran. And you have Iran, which doesn't have an air force, right? Which has got a creaky 1970s era air force, mostly obsolete aircraft. It's just bought 2 or 3 squadrons of aircraft, and that was the last purchases some 2 decades ago.
Right.
They have an air force in name only. They focused on cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and drones, right? But today you have the Iranian Air Force, which does not control its airspace. It's Israeli jets, American jets that have free run of Iranian airspace. And there's this report on social media, which I said, I have to verify this, where the Iranians are believed to have asked the Israelis for an air corridor so that the foreign minister could fly in and out of Iran. Don't shoot him down. So it was that kind of thing, that you don't have airspace control. You don't have your own airspace secured. So you have Iran, which is a drone, a missile, and a ballistic missile superpower, literally. I mean, it's so powerful. It has transferred this ballistic missile and cruise missile and drone capability to the Russian Federation. They're better than the Russians. Can you beat that? And yet they don't have control of their airspace. And that control can only be guaranteed by manned fighter aircraft of the kind that the Israeli Air Force is able to bring in. Like they have the F-35s and the F-15s and the F-16s. So you need both, I would argue. And in our case, for instance, yes, you need strategic bombers. And I think that is the reassessment that the Indian Air Force, interestingly, now, more than half a century after that original sin of not buying or leasing the Tu-22, has now gone in for the Tu-160. They're very interested in acquiring the Tu-160 backfire. NATO calls it the backfire. The Russian Federation, of course, calls it this beautiful, they call it the White Swan, because it's a very, very, very good-looking aircraft. It's almost identical to the American B-1, except that it's painted white dazzle paint. And there's something like about 20 of them in service. Now, the Indian Air Force, interestingly, had approached the Russian Federation for a lease of these bombers, something like between 6 and 8 of them. This was confirmed by Air Chief Marshal Arup Raha after he had retired a few years back. He was speaking at an event where he spoke about how the Indian Air Force is looking at supersonic bombers. Now that, unfortunately, it's because of the Russia-Ukraine war and Russia's own requirements. Those bombers, that's now, it's on the back burner for now. But the Indian Air Force is very clear. I'm not privy to the planning of this and the requirements for this, but the fact that you have a former air chief saying, yes, we are looking at strategic bombers, suggests that a whole lot of planning has gone into this. The need for an aircraft of this size. It's a massive aircraft. I've seen in fact, I've seen all 3. I've seen the Tu-22, the Tu-22 M3 when I'd gone to Russia, and of course the Tu-160. It's a massive aircraft. It's nearly the size of a 747. It can carry 40 tons of ordnance, which is double what the B-2 Spirit carries, the B-2
Right.
stealth bomber. And 40 tons, to give you an idea, Deepak, is like uh, it's almost carrying 6 to 7 MiG-21s in its belly.
Well, that's quite
That's the
something.
that's the kind of ordnance that it can carry. So clearly, the Air Force has kind of moved out of its tactical mindset now. It's a very different Indian Air Force, which is looking at China as the primary threat and which wants to acquire the Tu-160s. Obviously, when the fighting in Ukraine and Russia gets over, I think that lease would be revived. It's a very urgent operational requirement for that, and they're looking at something like a capability like this that will allow you to deliver not just conventional payloads, but nuclear strike as well. And possibly looking at the threat from China, because China has their fleet of bombers, HQ-19s. They've got a very large fleet of bombers, and we haven't got anything in that category. Nothing that can fly over 10,000 kilometers unrefueled, right? The Su-30 can do 10,000 plus with multiple refueling, but that means you'll have to tie down tankers, you need something like, say, a Tu-160 that can just take off from anywhere and fly around, go down a path that is not predicted by the enemy, and strike, deliver his payload, and then come back. So this is something that we are looking at very seriously. And of course, the issue of contested airspace, the one that you raised, is very valid because, the US, they struck the Iranian targets, the nuclear sites, with the B-2s after there was a suppression of enemy air defenses that was done by something like 100 fighter jets. Yeah, they flew DEAD, SEAD missions from the Arabian Peninsula. We possibly will have to do the same. Like Pakistan is not so much of a threat. We have the capability to strike at targets, as we've just demonstrated on the 10th of May. Standoff attacks from our airspace to neutralize their air bases. But for China, it's a whole new, different ball game. You will have to fly into contested airspace, heavily contested airspace. You have these AD bubbles that are built up on the Tibetan plateau, which we will first have to obviously neutralize. You have to create holes for the bombers to fly through, or you'll have to look at maybe another completely different route. So that gives you options. So the idea of getting a bomber like the Tu-60, which the Indian Air Force wants, is to give your Air Force option that you're not just looking at, say, the Himalayan frontier. You could possibly approach from, say, the South China Sea. Plan, a strike mission around another country or around another geography. That's the kind of mission flexibility that a bomber like the Tu-160 gives you. It's 12,000 kilometers plus. It can fly extended distances. I think it does supersonic. It flies supersonic for something like 45, almost an hour of supersonic, continuous supersonic speed. So that's a formidable capability. Of course, it's not stealth. That's the primary issue with this. And possibly the future Russian bombers that will come in will. There are already plans for stealthy Russian bombers to replace the Tu-160. But for our requirements, I think Tu-160 is something very good. And it actually reflects the changing mindset of the Indian Air Force from the tactical Air Force of the 1970s to the strategic Air Force that it is today in 2025.
Well, Sandeep, you really painted a picture of where we stand right now. You've painted a picture of what we wanted in the past. But nevertheless, again, at a time when India faces threats, say on our northern borders, we have a Western neighbor which still, does not refrain from provoking India. And yet again, we're a fast developing country with a lot of demand for resources. So again, money is at a premium. What do you think happens now?
You see, I mean, Operation Sindoor is a watershed in a way that it kind of will force us to reassess our requirements. There is a post-2025 Indian military, and there is a pre-2025 Indian military. And my sense is that the post-2025 Indian military will think very differently from the pre-2025 military, because now I think the era of war is on us, whether we like it or no. We may deny it. We may not be interested in war, but war is certainly interested in us from the way the Pakistanis have been, posturing and provoking, and the way China has been. So we need to prepare for everything. I mean, India is not a warmongering country or anything, but we need to prepare and we need to provide our services with the best possible options, whatever we have, whatever we can afford within the budget, and most importantly, Indian solutions for Indian wars. That I think that should be the mantra. And I have a sense that that is what we'll be looking at increasingly. Like the BrahMos, for instance, a fantastic example of Indian solutions for Indian war. When in 1991, after the Gulf War of 1991, where Indian planners kind of realized that, hey, we don't have a first strike conventional weapon, which is Dr. Pillai's, elucidated this so wonderfully on one of our podcasts. And that is how the requirement for the BrahMos was born, and how it is now inducted in widespread service across all three services, multiple variants. So I think now, post 2025, you're going to see a lot more of that happening. You'll see these services looking for Indian solutions to fight Indian wars. Of course, looking at the threat matrix very carefully, the kind of threats we are likely to face in the near term, and then plan and prepare for it accordingly. And that is where strategic bombers, I would think, fit in, people.
Stark words for stark times. But I think the key thing that you just said is that we need to look for Indian solutions to Indian problems. On that note, thank you so much, Sandeep, for joining us. And we'll speak to you again.
Thanks, Deep.